surrounding ourselves with people who like to read books about the countryside and food and farming, which is marvellous. So you're all very welcome. I'm just looking at some familiar faces, which is good. And as we met last week, I said that it would probably be a good idea to read something completely different to challenge ourselves somewhat. And we also had a fairly heavy book last month, although it was enjoyable. So I'm delighted to say that we're joined by Jane Clarke, who's a poet from Ireland. So Jane's there, and I'm going to hand over to Jane in a moment. And we're reading When the Tree Falls. So we're gonna have a completely different approach to our Q&A, because Jane's going to do some readings, which I'm really looking forward to. She informs me, which I think is great, that the book is sold out on Amazon, which I don't think is a bad problem to have, but it is a problem if you don't have a copy of the book. So Blood Axe Books, which is the publisher, which is based in Northumberland, they're quickly getting some new books to Amazon, but you can also buy it direct from them. So Ruth, who runs the book club with us, will put the link to Blood Axe Books into the chat. And there you go. Somebody already bought it from them, so that's good. Somebody just chatting away there. So please, be prepared with some questions. Certainly from my perspective, I'm not used to reading poetry, and I found the book that I've read already. I found it amazing, for want of a better adjective, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Jane and understanding your perspective as a poet and your background, and obviously listen to the poems. So I'm going to leave my introduction there, and Jane, say hi to you. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, thanks very much, Adam, and thanks for inviting me. It's really lovely to come to such a particular book club with the themes that you look at. I'm really delighted, and I can't see everybody, but I just want to say hello to everybody, and I'm thrilled that there's such an audience for this. I'm going to just talk a little bit about this collection, and then I'll read 3 poems from it, and then Adam's going to ask me some questions, and so that'll give more of a context for where the work comes from. But so if I just introduce the collection, I wrote this over 4 years. It was my second collection. My first collection took 10 years to write. The second one was a bit easier, but in the years that I was writing it, which was 2015 to 2019, my father was very ill, and he was in and out of hospital, and he died in January 2017. And so the book is very much about him, and he was a farmer all his life. He died at 87, and so you couldn't write anything about my father in a way without it being about farming. And so there's a lot of farming imagery and metaphor and details in the book. And so I suppose overall it is a book about loss and mourning, but it's also a book about celebration and I suppose about love of people and place and nature, because I suppose the nature is a huge theme in my work. And maybe just to say, I'm reading in Wicklow tonight, where I live with my wife in Wicklow. For about 25 years we've been here, but the farm I'll be referring to, which Adam will probably ask me more about later, is in County Roscommon in the Midlands. Anyway, the 3 poems to start. And this poem was written about 2 years before my father died, when he had been in hospital. That I could take away from him these long days in the hospital, the digging for a vein in his arm, the drip that stops him sleeping, the pain that makes him whisper, Jesus Christ, oh, Jesus Christ. That I could take him back to his cobblestones and barn, his rooks and the birch trees, his nettles and ditches, limestone and bog. That I could find the words to tell him what he will always be, horse chestnut petals falling pink in the yard, the well hidden in a blackthorn thicket, a summer evening's hush, cattle standing orange in the shallows. So then the next poem I wanted to read is actually from a day only maybe 2 or 3 weeks before Dad died, and we were nursing him at home for about 4 months. And I don't know, in the UK, do you have blue cards? Are there equivalent? In Ireland, blue cards are the kind of bovine passports that you have to have for your cattle. And so they're very important, and they'd be in anybody who's grown up on a farm in Ireland knows the blue cards and knows the row they'd get into if they were moved off the kitchen table. But anyway, so blue cards. Winter mornings he was gone before dawn, to fairs in Ballyhaunis, Claremorris, Ballinrobe. He came home with muck on his coat, smelling of shorthorns and Herefords. Sometimes he told us who he'd met, the blind man who knew each of his cows by their lowing, the widow who bargained harder than any dealer. But mostly he sat distracted by prices, cigarette smoke spiraling to the kitchen ceiling, blue cards spread around the table. Today, when everyone else was away, I wrapped him warm, pushed his wheelchair through the haggard, up the yard to the sheds. The cattle lifted doleful eyes from heaps of silage. "Hello, lads," he said. And then the last of these 3 poems. When my father died, we had a wake, and as you probably know, a wake is a really important part of the rituals in Irish society when there's a death, and people have missed that terribly over the last year. But luckily we knew that Dad's wake would be quite big, so it was spread out over 2 days. And people came from all over the west of Ireland. And I suppose someone who was farming for so long and had been, a cattle dealer and going to fairs, so it wasn't surprising there were so many people there, but it was a surprise to us. And I suppose during a wake, you see, in what people say about a person, you see how they knew him, which is different to how maybe you as a daughter or a wife or a brother respects. From Kiltoom, Creamully, Loughlin, Kilbegnet, Le Carrow, Atleague, Craigs, Carrowkeel, Ballinleg, they come to pay their respects. They shake hands with us, stand by his body and bow their heads. Cattlemen, sheepmen, carpenters, teachers, foresters, nurses, vets. They say prayers, lay their hands on his chest and bless themselves, then fill the kitchen with the man they knew. A grand man altogether, always out early, hardy as a wild duck, a good judge of a bullock. Fierce man to work. He had woeful hands, a man of his word. I slip out for a while to see an orange globe over the common and a flock of hooper swans feasting on the last of the winter grass. So there we go.
Jane, thank you. Just absolutely lovely. And particularly when we were, discussing before everybody joined, that you said that you would read respects, and yeah, I can be there. I've been at Irish funerals myself, and particularly I think, and I have a question on this I'd like to ask in a moment. Actually, whether that approach to a work like that is an Irish thing or a farming thing, because sometimes I recognise some of that. I know it's different in the UK, but I almost wonder if the sort of Irish approach to a work like that and remembering people is sometimes we see that in the farming community in the UK in a way that we don't see that in the wider community in the UK.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I don't know, it's a very different culture. I suppose my question is not about farming in that community. It's almost just as a starter. Um, you mentioned it before you read the poems. How do you think that has affected people in Ireland over the past 14 months, that it is such a big part of the culture and
I,
people haven't been able to do that?
I think it's been so difficult. You know, I know a neighbor of ours here, his sister died very early on in the time of the virus. And I know that he was saying that at Christmas, his greatest sadness was that they hadn't had a funeral. You know, that was the huge source of regret. I think it just makes it so hard to, you know, the wake allows, I suppose it allows the family to feel supported and not to feel so alone. I think there's been an awful lot of loneliness with people's grief, and not just from the virus. You see, I mean, obviously death has been happening in all kinds of ways in any case, not as naturally, you know, so I think it has been very, very difficult. I mean, we've had different rituals, you know, standing out at the gate. I'm sure you're doing that in the UK as well. Like we all stand out at the gate and the hearse goes down the road, or we all gather around the farm gate for another neighbour, you know. So we have found different ways of doing it, but it isn't the same by any means, you know.
I think, I mean, I don't want to extend it too much, but I've actually been to a couple of farmer funerals during the lockdown, and actually, in some ways, they've been more of a celebration than I would imagine they would have been if it hadn't been in the pandemic. Because
Right.
as you said, people stood out, and people
Yeah.
doing things different.
Yeah.
Um, just to help people along with the geography
Yeah.
of Ireland, I have some family connections to Ireland, so I have a bit of an idea, but I'm aware that not everybody will be. So you grew up in Roscommon and you now live in Wicklow.
Yeah.
Can
Yeah.
you talk to us just a little bit about where in Ireland that is and how they relate to each other, and you know, maybe how the difference between the counties has an effect on you and your writing?
Yeah, yeah, they're very, very, very different. Wicklow is south of Dublin, and it's mountainous, and it's on the coast as well. But it's very much, you know, and it's seen as, it's called the Garden of Ireland. It's where Glendalough is. It's very well known as a really beauty spot. And then Roscommon is kind of halfway across the country, a bit further than halfway across the country. And it's in the Midlands, but it's the West Midlands. It's the other side of the Shannon. And that's the big dividing thing in Ireland. Because once you cross the Shannon, that's when you start to see the stone walls and the fields get smaller and there's more, you know, it's more weeds. In a good way, wildflowers in the fields, and you know, so and Roscommon is probably, you know, it borders on Galway. So the next county over is Galway, which probably people listening would know, you know, and then Mayo, it borders on Mayo as well. And I suppose Roscommon is a county of bog, lake. It's a very watery county. There's lakes, there's rivers, there's streams, and there's a lot of rain. And it's and it's limestone land, so it's good land. There's a lot of very boggy, wet, rushy, lower, you know, land on the riverbanks, but then it's also very good land. The limestone is good, and it has this thing called the turlocks, which I don't know if people know. You know, these disappearing lakes. So that, you know, there's a field. We have a turlock field at home, and there's, you know, one morning you'd go out and there's a lake there, and then, you know, a week later it'll be pasture. I mean, it's kind of, I always think no wonder people believed in fairies. I mean, because it's just magical, isn't it? That there'll be this enormous and then it's gone, you know. But anyway, so that's a bit about, you know, and I grew up on a dry livestock farm, mixed farm. So it was beef cattle mainly. My father loved his cattle, and sheep, you know, a few sheep. And Roscommon is known as sheep stealer county. So it was always a great sheep county. And but we would have had a cow to milk, you know, one cow, you know, the way that mixed farming, that was, you know, I was born in 1961, so I lived on the farm, you know, in the 60s and 70s. So farming was very different, and it was mixed, and it was a little bit of everything. And also all the family were very involved in the farm. I think that's not, you know, with bigger farms now, that's not necessarily so. It can be very separate. The business of the farm can be very separate from the family. But it wasn't like that when we were growing up, you know. And sometimes that was for better or for worse. We didn't always want to be involved in the farm, but you were, and that was it, you know.
I get this. I get the sense that whenever I've been to Ireland, or even, you know, obviously talking to you about your upbringing and family circumstances, that that people are probably one step closer to farming still in Ireland,
Yeah,
in a way that I know we have people from all over the world, but we're mainly focused on the UK probably in this call.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and you know, in some ways, do you think that that affects people's attitude towards farming in the countryside in Ireland?
Yeah, I most people in Ireland don't seem to be too far back away from farming, and it does influence all aspects of Irish life still. Um, and I mean, and I think there's a quite a big understanding of farming, and um, I suppose it's still one of our really big industries as well, you know. So I suppose people know farming from a kind of a rootedness that, you know, that's there in terms of family, but also it being very important part of people's livelihoods, and you know.
I
Yeah, and because we didn't have industrialization like you did, so that, you know, it was a very different model of development we had. Yeah.
suppose, you know, coming on to what interests you as a writer, you know, if we look through this collection, I know you read some, you know, some more poems shortly, but there is that connection with people who you're writing in this collection, and the connection with place.
Yeah.
So, what would you say interests you more as a writer?
Um,
Just spent a long time talking about place.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose the people I write about, I always see them in their place. So I think people is probably, you know, it's often people who gets the poem going, you know, who get the poem going for me. It's a thought about a person, or, you know, but it has, I see them in place. So I think, I mean, isn't it very interesting that most of us, we are very associated with a place. A place can shape us, and, you know, our emotional, but our identity is very linked with place, I think, you know. So they're not divided for me, really. Um, so, you know, so say when I would, you know, one of my first poems was about my grandmother. And in the poem, you know, she grew up on the north coast of Donegal, and then moved to get married and live in Galway. And, you know, Donegal is in that poem, and Galway's in the poem. And I couldn't write about her without including Donegal, you know. So I think that's, you know, that's just interesting to me, how place is so important to us. I think Adam is frozen there. Is that right? Or have I frozen?
No, you've not frozen. I hadn't noticed Adam had, but luckily, because we are super organised, Adam has left me the questions. So,
Okay.
I'm not as eloquent as him, obviously, but we'll do our best. So the next question that he was going to ask is, how do you deal with writing about real people? You rarely name them, but explicitly, but family members often feature in your poems.
Yeah, that is a very good question. I suppose mostly it's my mother and father, and they, I think, were very generous about me writing about them. They're very private people, shy people, but and so this was totally, I mean, I was totally surprised when I started writing poetry. I didn't know what I would write or who I would write about, but I think they've just been very generous. I think they understood that I needed to do this, and and I suppose they enjoy the poems. So they never tried to censor what I write at all, you know.
Well, I kind of understand that because although my mum and dad are on this, watching this as well, but my brother is a playwright. So very often we go and see one of his plays, and either a family legendary story or something that we recognise in ourselves is on it. So I think I can see that from the other perspective of them, and I'm hoping that Adam has reappeared and can take back over.
Okay, is he there?
He is there, yeah.
I have, but this was a really interesting discussion to come back into after my internet had gone the wrong way. Thank you. Shall we read some more poems?
Yeah.
And then we'll come to some questions. I'm seeing your questions, everybody, and I'll come to those as well. And sorry about my connection, but I'll hand over to you, Jane, for some more poems from the book.
Great, yes. Well, I wanted to read a poem for my mother. And I suppose this is, my mother was a feminist before she would have called herself a feminist, before feminism was called that. And she saw education as being so important, and she really pushed that for her only girl. I've four brothers, two brothers on either side, but she was going to make sure the girl got education. But at the same time, she trained me in her skills. So anyway, hers. My mother said she just knew I was going to be a girl. 2 boys before me and 2 boys after, fodder for a hungry farm. But I was hers. She taught me her tricks of the trade. It'll look like dinner is nearly ready if the table is set when he comes in. Bread and butter will fill them up. Add 3 drops of vinegar to water so your mirrors and windows will gleam. Cool your fingers before rubbing lard into flour for pastry. A handful of ground almonds will keep your fruitcake moist. Darn a few socks every night and never leave the ironing for more than a week. Don't cut off rhubarb stalks with a knife, just twist them clean from the crown. And always hold on to the children's allowance. A woman must have something of her own. And linked to that theme of feminism, in the 4 years that I was working on this book, I suppose just enormous change was happening in Irish society, and a lot of it for the good. And I suppose that was one of the things when I was talking about the wake that I should have said, that I think Ireland can be very traditional, but it is also very modern. And I like the way we've kept some of the very valuable traditions, but I also like the way some of our ways of being have had to change. Anyway, this poem, Polling Station, is about the repeal of the 8th Amendment, which permitted the government to legislate for abortion for the first time in Ireland. This was May 25th, 2018. Polling Station. In the queue up to the door of the schoolhouse, neighbours welcome sunshine after the wettest of wet winters. Spirits lift at the sight of fields drying out, grass thickening, calves thriving, unstoppable growth. There's talk of young ones speeding home to vote, swallows back to the barn. No one asks anyone where they'll place their ex. Every family has stories left like ploughs and harrows among thistles behind the sheds. And I suppose that poem in a way reflects the greater compassion in Irish society. I felt that referendum brought out a lot of compassion for each other. The last poem of these three is towards the end of the book, and it's from a story my mother would have told me at the kitchen table with my father listening, kind of half embarrassed. The Yellow Jumper. They weren't married long when she saw it. A turtleneck jumper in Murray's window, yellow as happiness, as the flash on a goldfinch's wings. She imagined him wearing it at the fairs, standing out from all the rest in their greens and greys. 18 shillings and sixpence. She paid for it on tick, threepence a week. For all that he smiled on his birthday, it remained on the back of the bedroom chair. One day, she folded and packed it in the chest with the spare candles, letters, photographs, and the other questions she didn't ask. She likes to think of him there, among pens of breeding heifers, weanlings and hoggets, splendid in yellow. Very sound.
Jane, thank you. And I have some questions before I come on to everybody else's, and keep them coming, everyone. I'm storing them up, and we've got some really good ones. I suppose thinking of the poem that you just read there, Polling Station, what prompted you to write a poem?
Yeah, well, it's usually an emotional, something gets stirred in me emotionally. So, I mean, that day it was, you know, the polling station is down at the end of our road here in this old schoolhouse. And it was just such a beautiful day. And I was really, I suppose, very touched, because I mean, I'd been campaigning for abortion rights, and you know, when I was in my 20s in Dublin as a student, you know, and you know, then I was just very touched by this change in Irish society, and the compassion, and so I just really wanted to mark that. So it has to really matter to get a poem going. But you can see it was the place that got it going, this little old schoolhouse and the people standing. So people and place again is what gets it going for me. And I suppose then thinking about that change where we are acknowledging in Ireland that every family has its stories and has its secrets. And that's a big change, you know, that has been happening in Ireland over the last, 20 years or so. Yeah.
And that people are starting to talk about these things more as well. I suppose that referendum, and you know, we watched that in our house from afar as well. That was a very powerful moment, that people were flying. You know, there's huge Irish diaspora, that people were flying back to Ireland to vote. This was a big moment.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I've got some questions here from people joining the call. Mavanwe Alexander says, does the Irish language influence your writing at all?
I think that's a very good question. You see, you know, I grew up speaking Irish in school, learning Irish in school. I don't speak Irish now, but I could if I had to, and I get back into it again. But I think there's a lot of Irish English. And I think probably for a poet or any writer to be steeped in at least one other language is very good for you, because you're always comparing. And I suppose I loved Irish, so I think I don't think it's a direct influence, but I think it's in the ether of my writing, definitely. And I'm very glad I learned Irish and spoke Irish in school, because I think it definitely widened my vocabulary and my awareness of words, really, I suppose, love of words, you know.
And would you say that, obviously there are parts of Ireland where Gaelic is spoken, in comparison to elsewhere, and would you say that where you grew up, that you would hear more of the Irish language in comparison to where you live now? You know, is it Is
Um,
there any connection to make to the rural?
Yeah, well, probably more, but the further west you went, you'd get more and more. But I mean, I suppose a lot of Irish words were used as part of just everyday language then, much more than now and much more than here. I mean, the thing is that Irish was associated with poverty and people wanted to move away from that as well. That's part of what happened, you know.
Mm.
But there is a greater valuing of it now.
Just thinking about it, it's a good follow-on. You were talking about when you were growing up, but Kate says, did you grow up with poetry? You know, was there poetry at school or at home, and when did you start to write?
Yeah, and there was poetry at school, and there was poetry at home, definitely. And now again, it was only when I started to write that I realized there was poetry at home. Like, I mean, first of all, the Bible. My father was always quoting the Bible and hymns, singing hymns. I mean, there's tremendous poetry in the Bible, tremendous poetry in the Psalms. Yeah, and then there was the songs we were learning. They were very poetic. The songs, traditional Irish songs we learned in school. And then, I mean, I don't know when I first heard Patrick Kavanagh. He's this poet of County Monaghan, a farmer poet. I'm not sure when I first heard him, but it was the poetry I could really relate to. But I do remember loving Hopkins, wheel shoot long, weeds and wheel shoot long and lovely and lush, and I just loved those lines. So, but the kind of poetry I enjoyed as a child was the poetry I could relate to, that had something to do with the world that I lived in. And I think that's a really important way of getting into poetry. But again, I wouldn't have said there was poetry, until I started to write. And then I thought, oh yeah, there was. My mother taught me The Owl and the Pussycat. That was my piece, my party piece. So even that, getting that rhythm is, that was very valuable to me.
I think in part you've answered a question here from Liz Charles, but maybe there are others. It's in two parts. I'll ask you the first one first. Which Irish poets have influenced you, if any? You always mentioned Patrick Kavanagh, but she also asks, do you write primarily to be read silently or for the poems to be read out?
Yeah, no, they're good questions. I mean, Patrick Kavanagh would have been probably, big influence, but also obviously Seamus Heaney was a big influence, but also people like Evan Boland and Paula Meehan and, I mean, just so many Irish poets, but also, I mean, I do want to say Gillian Clarke, the Welsh poet, who is also a farmer poet, she knows lots about farming. If people are looking for other, poetry linked with farming, Gillian is a beautiful, so she would have influenced me too. But the second question was, what was the second question?
Just around, do you write primarily to be read silently
yes.
or for the poems to be read out?
Yeah, the music is really important. So when I'm writing a poem, I write it aloud. I'm repeating the line, repeating to try and get the music in the line. So I'm primarily, you could say I'm primarily a page poet because all my work is published, but I think it's really important to read it aloud. And poetry is an oral art primarily, and so poetry should be musical and memorable. And that's how they're the two ways of knowing if it's a good poem. It should stay in your mind, so the music is very important. Reading it aloud is very important. Yeah.
Just before I have another question from Michelle Worrett around, if you like, the process of writing a poem. But I just want to ask you about, just prompted my memory of when we had a previous discussion around some work that you've done in Ireland on being on radio and on farming programs. And obviously we can try and listen again to that afterwards. But do you want to just outline that and how that's come about over time and sparked people's interest in your work?
Yeah, well, how did it come about? It was this time last year, the Countrywide program, which is a radio program on a Saturday morning for an hour. And it is very, very popular, but it's a little bit like the theme of your book club. You know, it's a program that looks at farming and nature and food producers and anything linked with that world. So but it's funny, why they heard of me was because of a program I did for Radio 4, in fact, you know, so that's gas, you know, it was BBC, but I had done a half-hour poetry program for Radio 4 about the mining heritage in County Wicklow. And in that, I interviewed a sheep farmer here, a neighbour of ours. And that then got countrywide interested. And so I read my poem. The interviewer came down here, went for a walk, read some poems. And so that definitely helped get my work into a different audience. And I suppose I feel really strongly about that poetry shouldn't be off in the bookshelves. You know, that the more people who get the pleasure of poetry and the meaning of poetry, the better. Like, I see poetry as being like music. And, you know, imagine if nobody had ever listened to music. You'd think that was such a tragedy in people's lives. Well, you see, I feel about that if people haven't had poetry. But I'm afraid there are people who don't, because they've been put off by it, you know. So anyway, I was very glad to have it in that farming program for that very reason, you know. And they're doing some more now. I've just recorded yesterday and sent them some other work. Yeah.
Brilliant. Just coming back to the process, if you like, Michelle, where it asks, you write poems of such elegant form. How do you do that? She says, I don't know how to write poetry. And this is it planned or does it happen instinctively? And I suppose I would add to that,
Yeah.
You know, in your time as a poet, how do you feel that you've changed? You know, or does a second or third collection become easier to write?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, it is work. Like, I mean, you know, just to say I wasn't able to, the person who asked that question, I mean, to say that when I started, I was 44, I think, when I wrote my first poem. I wasn't able to write poetry either. I just, you know, I was on a writing course and I was required to write poems. And, you know, so I just got going. I tried something and I got encouraging feedback. And then I just kept, I learned more and more and more. I read others. I mean, one of the best ways of learning how to write poetry is to look at poets' work that you enjoy and learn from how they do it. But also, like, I was in a workshop group. So I got feedback on my work. Very quickly, I started to take it really seriously because I sort of fell in love with it. And, you know, so now I work on my poetry every day, really. So it is work. It's like any craft. It's like, you know, the way that be somebody maybe in your group here now who's a painter, and I'd be saying, I don't know how to do that. And they'd probably say, well, I've had to learn bit by bit by bit. And it's the very same, you know. And then there was a second question. I can't remember. You said something else, Adam.
Yeah, I added on, didn't you? Michelle said, is it planned or does it happen instinctively? And then I was asking, you know, has it changed over time or does it get, I don't know, is that a thing? Does it get easier?
Yeah, no, it's funny. It doesn't get easier. Putting together the second collection was easier than the first, definitely, because I was more confident and I knew myself what, you know, like the title came to me. I just was very clear. I wasn't asking other people, what will I call it, kind of thing. Whereas the first collection, I was much more looking for advice. And even the shaping of the second collection, I knew myself more how I wanted to organize it. So there's definitely a confidence. But every single new poem is most of them, you know, some poems come easily, but most of them are work, or hard work. And that there's nearly always a time when you think, oh, well, I often think, oh, I'll never write another poem, or I'll never get this poem to work, or you get really disheartened, you know, just like, I suppose, in anything we feel strongly about and want to do, you know. So
and do you stick on a poem if one is harder, if it's becoming hard to write? Do you put it to one side and start something else, or do you feel like you have to work at it and go, this is happening.
It's a bit of both. Sometimes it is better just leave it and go away from it. But then what could happen is you read something else and you go back to it. You know, I'd have said, oh, look, that's going nowhere. And then I'd read something and some way something gets stirred and I'd just go back to it and it starts to move. So it's, you know, it's not a logical kind of a process. It's more, it's like some log jam inside yourself has to get, you know, loosened up, and then you find the word you want, or, you know.
I have a question here from Bob Lawrence. He says, in your poem, River at Dawn, you capture very well a crew rowing on the Shannon. And he says, from the language you use, you must have had an experience of rowing, or you did some very good research.
So that poem's in my first collection, so that's lovely. Yeah, well, actually, it was my nephew. My nephew was rowing at the time. He was in Trinity, and he doesn't row at all now. He lives in London, but I was so, we watched him. We went to watch him. He was on the Liffey, and I was just really taken by it. So it was him, and he gave me the vocabulary. And then, of course, I had watched people on the Shannon in both. And I suppose it's just such a beautiful, watching people in a boat rowing. I think it's one of the most beautiful things. You know, I suppose it's because it's the river, the water, the kind of peace, the rhythm. It's a bit like, you know, the rhythm of a poem that way, you know. So
I have a question here from Caroline. I suppose it's maybe back to this idea of place and what influences you, but the question probably has its roots in the people that were there as well. But she says she recently watched a fascinating program about the Irish dance halls that sprung up in the middle of nowhere as an alternative to church halls, barns with decorative frontages. And she says, is there one near you, or do you have memories of them?
Well, funnily enough, what I have memories of, there was the marquee used to come in the summer, and the marquee would be set up in the school yard and the field where it was the football field, and it was set up there, and there'd be dances, you know, for a week in the summer, and but we weren't allowed go. So we'd be hanging out the window of the house listening to the music, and the cattle would be going crazy in the field, running back and forth to this loud music. That's what I remember. But yeah, she's right. The Ballroom of Romance was one of the famous dance halls down in the West, down in Mayo. Yeah.
I have a question here that are prepared before. How do you deal with writing about real people? So you rarely name people explicitly in your poems, but clearly family members, and particularly in, you know, that there's a huge part of this collection, they often feature. So how do you deal with that? Because, you know, some things might be uncomfortable.
Yeah. Now that was the one Ruth asked that earlier.
Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, no, that's okay. But what I was saying is that Mum and Dad were very kind of generous always to me about that. But I suppose I do try and keep a bit of distance, keep enough distance, you know. And what else? What else? I suppose sometimes I don't publish. You know, there are poems that I have written that if I think somebody wouldn't want it or wouldn't be okay about it, that I don't publish, you know. So I think it is something to be careful about, you know. Yeah.
And I suppose it might be a cheeky question, but what's next? You know, what are you writing now, or what can we expect? This isn't me wrapping up because I've got some more questions, but
right. Yeah. No, I'm working on my third collection, and I can see it shaping up, but I'm trying to not too quick, too soon put a structure on it. But you know, yeah, and I suppose more of my work this time will be from the uplands, from Wicklow. Which is interesting to me. I mean, I think at the heart of it, there will be some poems about my mother. My mother has dementia, and so I'm caring quite a bit for her at the moment. And so I know that there will be poems about that experience at the heart of it. And then I think around it will be a lot of Wicklow poems about living here in the uplands. Yeah.
I've got a really excellent question just come in from Elizabeth. She says, I suppose the context for this is, I mentioned before when we spoke to prepare for this about the other books that we read,
Yeah.
some of which touch on politics, the future for agriculture and things like that. But Elizabeth's question is, how might poetry reach where policy and politics can't? And for some context, there's local elections in the UK today. And Elizabeth says they seriously lack beauty and inspiration, though they're vital.
Well, I would answer that in terms of nature. How I feel about, say, about climate change, for example. I think we have to really care and what we care about, what we love. I think if poetry can put us in touch with what we love, can put us in touch with what's important, can put us in touch with what's precious, what we might lose. I think that is the power of poetry. And, I think there are absolutely wonderful nature poets who do that. Like there's Michael Longley from, Belfast, for example, who writes a lot about Mayo, fantastic nature poet. And, but I mean, there are just so many, I could keep on naming them, but so I think if surely it's the same about farming, that if it puts people in touch with the way of life and the values of that life and what might be lost in the way farming is going, there must be a power in that, I think,
Do you get the sense that there's almost, and maybe you've seen this in the time that you've been writing, a reawakening almost of people's connection with nature? I feel like we've seen it during the COVID pandemic.
Yes.
Where people are questioning what they value. And would you sense that as well?
Absolutely. It really is noticeable. And I think that'll be hopefully it'll be one of the big gifts of the pandemic, that people have realized that is what they have when the chips are down, is that, nature. And I suppose it is hard to keep hope. The more you know about the climate crisis, it is heartbreaking. So I suppose people need to keep in touch with what they love and what can give them pleasure to keep us with a sense of hope. Not, because I think we could lose our sense that it's worth trying to change things, because it can feel like it's nearly gone already. It's species eradication, extinction, and everything. So,
yeah, the sort of power that a sense of hope can bring, that a better world can be built. I think that's definitely of the moment.
Yeah.
I have a question here from Sarah who says, given the work you put into your poems, can you predict which ones resonate the most? Or and in addition to that, do the poems or people's reactions to them ever surprise you?
You can't really predict. No, you can't predict. I mean, sometimes, so surprise me. Like there is a poem in the River, the first book, the title poem of it. Somebody sent me a really long message saying that she had seen me read this poem, and it is all about loss. And she said that she had lost both her mother and her sister, and seeing me read a poem about loss and seeing that I had obviously recovered from whatever loss had led to that poem gave her hope. I thought that was really, really wonderful, so it wasn't just the poem, it was something about the reading of it. So that was, say, a very surprising reaction. I suppose, I was just really surprised with the response to particularly the first collection, the love for the collection. I was really surprised. I felt so fortunate. I was beyond my wildest dreams. It was one of those moments of, wow, could this be happening? And, so I'm very grateful for that, yeah.
I'm conscious of time because I know that we like to do a reading at the end. So I said by the time we get to maybe around this time, we might think about drawing things to a close. but I just have some announcements quickly.
Yeah.
I did announce these the last time we spoke, but some people might be new to the call. So just so people know, next month we're reading this book by, hope you can see that with my light. It's actually called Fieldwork, which has got nothing to do with us, but it's a great name for a book, by Bella Bathurst. So Bella's going to join us in June. And then in July, we're going to read Melissa Harrison, who's a nature writer, and this is about moving from London to Suffolk. So if you've missed that last time, I will put this on the email to everybody, but I just wanted to make that announcement. And I suppose as we start to wrap up, it's a huge thank you, Jane. I hope other authors who've joined us in the other books that we've read aren't listening. I know they're not on the call, but this is actually, and please don't think that I say this to everybody, because I don't, this has been my favourite session. And I was talking to my wife, who is an ex English teacher, and she was delighted when I ordered the book that I read it from start to finish. I read the poems from start to finish, and really, really felt that I could read poetry in a way that I never had before since school. So it's you know, sort of chair's prerogative to say something personal, sorry, but thank you. And you know, particularly the one about respect, and you know, the experiences of you know, death and loss in Ireland really resonated with me, but also the sort of practical elements of farm life. And I think probably when people were nodding when you were reading some of those and some of the comments that I've seen on social media, I think it resonates with all of us.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
So what I would like to do now is, I think we have something really special at the end that you should introduce, and at the end we will all say goodbye. But I want to give the final thing to you, and a huge thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Adam. Thank you to you and to Ruth for all the work on this, and thanks to everybody who's watching and listening. I just want to, I'm going to read a new poem, but before I do that, I just want to say I wish I could tell my father about tonight. He'd be delighted that I was talking to these farmers in the UK. He would love it. But anyway, so this poem is for a neighbour of ours here who died in January, and I actually gave it to his widow yesterday, and it was sparked off by James Rebanks's reading. His book was read on Radio 4. Now, I had already read his book, but when I heard it read again, that helped me write this poem. Shepherd. When he was a boy, these upland fields grew more gorse and rushes than grass. He dug up rocks, shifted stones to ditches and laneways, ploughed hummocks into the ground, harrowed furrows, seeded tilth. We'd meet him on our way up Kirrikee. Crouched to a ewe on our rump, he'd be clearing thorns from sore hooves before trimming. He'd pause to lament harsh weather, or laugh at lambs nudging each other from hillocks. Was it last year we first saw him sit for a breath, his collie resting her head on his knee? On a midwinter morning, neighbours line the length of road downhill to the church at Ballinatone. Ewes huddled close in lambing sheds, and through the 5-bar gate to the yard, an easterly wind lilt silver.
Jane, thank you very much, and thank you so much to everyone for joining. So we haven't done this before, but people are doing a round of applause even though they're on mute, so I can see everybody clapping. I don't know, Jane, if you can see everybody, but everybody's clapping. So thank you so much, and I hope we're able to see you again.
Thanks very much.
Take care, and thanks everyone. Bye bye.